Konstantin Kisin, the British and Russian comedian, is off the fence about the Israel-Gaza war, and we apparently should care about this. Why, I don't know, but millions of people have watched his video, and while anyone with a basic understanding can probably see through his arguments, he claims in a tweet that no one has addressed a single argument he's made. So I thought, let's try and address your video as a whole and your specific arguments. Firstly, you give the impression that you were on the fence, and so recently, through educating yourself about the Israel-Gaza conflict and first principle thinking, you came to an undeniable logical fact that you should support Israel.
In summary, I've engaged with an open mind and in good faith with all the anti-Israel arguments presented to me over the last year. On balance, I regard them as disingenuous, irrelevant, and designed to pull at my heartstrings in order to obscure the harsh reality of this conflict. We would respond exactly the way that Israel has.
Now, it's obvious you were never really on the fence, particularly when your research simply reiterates Zionist talking points. There's really nothing new in what you've actually said. In fact, also, as far back as the 5th of December 2023, you were making pretty much similar arguments with Piers Morgan on his show.
Well, yes, I think I am right, Piers. But also the other thing I would say is I share the moral quandary that you were talking about with Neil Ferguson earlier. Nobody can look at the pictures of what we're seeing from Gaza and be in any way happy about what is happening. But I think if we're being honest, let's look at what the Allies, Britain and the Americans did during the last year of World War II. We dropped more than a Hiroshima a day on Germany for a year non-stop in order to win that war. And I think if you look at it from Israel's point of view, imagine what the equivalent of that would be here in the UK. It would be equivalent of, say, the IRA during the Troubles, invading northern England, killing over 8,000 people, taking 1,000 people hostage. And what do you think Margaret Thatcher would have done? I think we have to be clear about the inability to make a moral comparison between these two while having every bit of compassion for innocent civilians who are caught up in this.
So it seems you haven't really evolved your views much. You certainly didn't come across as though you were on the fence with that particular response. So your recent video comes across as attempting to sound unbiased, unemotional, in order to convince the audience that your research and anyone's research would naturally come to the conclusion in siding with Israel. It's just an objective fact. And part of this is trying to appeal to the idea that you are engaged in first principle thinking.
I read, watched and listened to the endless commentary, debates and discussions to understand what people on various sides were saying. Having gathered those perspectives, I then did my best to apply first principles thinking to the arguments I heard. Thinking from first principles means stripping whatever you're trying to analyze down to its core and working back from there.
Yet at no time did you demonstrate any first principle thinking in this matter. Look, making comparisons to what other states would do is not engaging in first principle thinking. Saying, well, Britain or America would do likewise is not first principle thinking. You see, your whole argument seems to be an emotional appeal to what other states, Western states that is, would do, and then claim therefore if Western states did it, it would therefore be right. If it really was about first principle thinking, you'd actually define what your first principles are. What are your very foundational thoughts you stand upon to then develop your arguments? That's what first principle thinking is, and in no way do you spell out, nor define, nor even justify your foundational thoughts on this issue are. Now, this isn't superfluous to the video, because if your methodology is flawed or contradictory or simply doesn't exist, you don't have a methodology, then your conclusions are not something to be seen necessarily true or trusted. If I say based on the scientific method I came to these scientific conclusions, but then do not demonstrate any scientific method that I relied upon, or simply use a different method, then the scientific conclusion would be considered untrustworthy, would be thrown into doubt. That doesn't mean it's necessarily false, but it does question the credibility in what's being presented as an argument. You see, you also claim that the logic of your argument is impenetrable.
Whatever your view of the history of this conflict, I believe the logic of this is impenetrable.
Now, logic is assessing whether the conclusion follows from your premises. If it does, it's a valid structure. If it doesn't, it's invalid. But the truthfulness of the conclusion isn't just dependent upon whether the premises leads to the conclusion. The truth is also fundamentally determined if the premises are true and shown to be true. If then you want to make a first principle logical argument, you have to state what your premises are. In essence, what are your foundational thoughts? What justifies them? And then show that these premises and comparison these foundational thoughts leads inevitably to the conclusion that you have, which is in your case, we should support Israel. You don't do this anywhere in your video. Then inexplicably, you then change your method.
So what does first principle thinking tell us about the conflict? First, the easiest way to understand a complicated problem is to find a comparable situation about which you already know what to think.
Now, it's not about building a conclusion on foundational thoughts that can't be reduced, but simply comparing one act with another. That, by definition, isn't first principle thinking. Even then, your comparisons are just weak and false. They simply do not justify support for Israel. Let's go further into your argument.
First, the easiest way to understand a complicated problem is to find a comparable situation about which you already know what to think. For example, if we accept that October 7th was a terrorist attack, as I believe most people do, the obvious approach would be to compare it to other terrorist attacks in recent history. That, as it happens, is impossible, because on a proportionate basis, the Western world has never experienced an attack on this scale. If we take 9/11, the most impactful terrorist attack in living memory, which shook the world's dominant superpower to its very core, we see that 2,977 people were killed in a country of 285 million people. On October 7th, approximately 1,200 people were killed in a country of just 9 million people. Some keep calling October 7th Israel's 9/11, but that isn't remotely true. If October 7th was Israel 9/11, on a per capita basis, only 100 people would have been killed. In other words, October 7th was at least 12 times as bad as 9/11. And that's before accounting for the fact that Hamas took hundreds of hostages, many of whom have been killed since. So the obvious question is, if thousands of armed Mexicans had penetrated the southern border of the United States, killed 36,000 Americans, and dragged off thousands of hostages, how would America have reacted? Would there still be a Mexico to speak of?
In essence, your argument boils down to this. October 7th was a uniquely terrible act of terrorism, and if this occurred in any other Western country, they would have done the exact same thing as Israel. That's your argument. Firstly, you gloss over the fact that it's a terrorist attack. You just assume it to be the case. And I'm not here to justify October 7th. However, using first principle thinking, which is what you keep saying that you do, we'd first have to assess how to categorize October 7th. Appealing to Western states or Israel, or even the majority of people, is not automatic justification to assign this as a terrorist act. Even then, which majority are you appealing to? Those in the West, who form the minority of the world's population? What about the rest of the world? As I'm sure you are aware, most people do not form their opinions for themselves, but have their opinions formed by those in power. So really, even if we grant the majority of people consider it a terrorist attack, yet by your own admission, most people are actually ignorant about Israel-Gaza conflict, then it follows appealing to the majority wouldn't be a good enough justification to judge October 7th as a terrorist attack or not. However, there are academics who argue that actually October 7th shouldn't be categorized as a terrorist attack, but rather an act of armed resistance. For instance, this is what Judith Butler, member of the Jewish Voice for Peace, states.
I think it is more honest and historically correct to say that the uprising of October 7th was an act of armed resistance. It is not a terrorist attack, and it's not an anti-Semitic attack. It was an attack against Israelis, and, I did not like that attack. I have gone public with this. I have gotten in trouble for saying it was, for me, anguishing. The violence done to Palestinians has been happening for decades. This was an uprising that comes from a state of subjugation and against a violent state apparatus. Okay, let us be clear. Now, you can be for or against armed resistance, you can be for or against Hamas, but let us at least call it armed resistance, and then we can have a debate about whether we think it's right or whether they did the right thing. The problem is, if you call it armed resistance, you are immediately thought to be in favor of armed resistance and in favor of that armed resistance and that tactic. It's like, well, actually, maybe not that tactic, and we can discuss armed resistance. You know, it is an open debate.
Now, simply saying it's an act of armed resistance doesn't mean what occurred followed the rules of the laws of war. That again is two separate issues. Armed resistance could occur, but the actions perpetrated in the name of this armed resistance could still be considered illegal or immoral. You like comparisons, so here's one for you. The Nat Turner slave rebellion. This rebellion by slaves not only killed their slave masters, but also their families too. Men, women, and even children. Yet America honors Nat Turner today, naming parks after him. They separate the cause of the rebellion, which they consider good, from the brutality and the horrific actions that occurred in the name of that rebellion. So it's not a given, and certainly not first principle thinking to simply state October 7th was a terrorist act. And I'm sure that if the term was in use during Nat Turner's time, he'd be called a terrorist then. But now, today, he's honoured. Second, you attempt to argue that proportionally the number of deaths in Israel would be proportionate to 12 9/11s. That's not an argument. In fact, it sounds like an appeal to emotions now.
So the obvious question is, if thousands of armed Mexicans had penetrated the southern border of the United States, killed 36,000 Americans, and dragged off thousands of hostages, how would America have reacted? Would there still be a Mexico to speak of?
The breakdown of your argument is basically saying this: because of the massive loss of life that occurred, this would create such sentiments, or in other words, emotions, that would justify the type of reaction Israel is conducting. That's what you're saying. The problem is we can all play this type of numbers game and proportional game. For instance, 1,391 Palestinians were killed by Israel in Gaza in 2009. And in 2014, 2,251 Palestinians were killed in Gaza, again by Israel. In just these two events, we have 3,642 people killed in Gaza, which has approximate population of 2 million people. If this was proportional to the number of Americans, this would be America suffering from over 500,000 dead. Would Americans accept that? How many 9/11s would that have been? And would not Americans think that they should have the right to fight back? And this all predates October 7th, and this is all the while Palestinians are kept under occupation in what's been described by the former British Prime Minister David Cameron as an open-air prison, and who also face constant threats of bombings and raids by Israeli forces. So to use your argument, what would any people's response be if they face this type of situation? But your analogy gets worse, because then you attempt to compare thousands of armed Mexicans undertaking a terrorist attack against America causing 12 9/11s. No, it doesn't follow that America would be considered moral if it destroyed the whole entire Mexican country.
Would there still be a Mexico to speak of?
Mexico has a population of 127 million people. Are you suggesting that a few thousand armed Mexicans who killed 36,000 Americans would justify targeting and affecting the lives of 127 million people, stating in your own words there wouldn't be a Mexico to speak of? You see, that's not a justification, whether intellectual or otherwise. But the analogy is just wrong. You see, Mexico isn't currently occupied by America. Mexico agrees to its borders. Mexico isn't constantly being bombed by America. Mexico isn't under siege by America. America doesn't dictate what can be built in Mexico, nor does America control Mexicans' ability to leave or control their water, food, medicine, or fuel or electricity. So the analogy is just blatantly false. It's just a crap analogy. If your whole argument is premised on comparing two similar events and then arguing that the West would do the same, then at least use two similar, analogous events. And then you go on to try and break down claims made by the pro-Palestinian sides.
Number one, history did not start on October 7th. The crux of this argument, when broken down to its central premise, is that the state of Israel is illegitimate. In this conception, Israel was created because land belonging to Palestinians was taken by Western powers and given to European Jews fleeing the Holocaust. Palestinians were not consulted, did not give consent, and found themselves kicked out of their homes. Israel is a settler colonial state. 2. October 7th was a response to Israeli brutality and oppression. Those of you who watched my debate with Safety Amos will recall that he made this argument repeatedly. The people of Gaza and the West Bank are treated so badly, he argued, the response we saw on October 7th was totally understandable. An act of resistance aimed at redressing the wrongs they have suffered. 3. Israel is killing civilians. The scenes of parents pulling their children out of rubble speak for themselves. 4. Israel is engaged in indiscriminate attacks, which is why so many innocent people are dying. This argument aims to prove that Israel is the bad guy in this war because it is killing lots of people, either deliberately or due to a callous disregard for the lives of Palestinians.
Now, each one of your supposed presentations of the pro-Palestinian or anti-Israeli arguments seems to juxtapose this as a justification of October 7th. You see, implicit in your whole video is that the reason you are justified in being pro-Israel is that October 7th is an unjustified act of terrorism. But that just doesn't follow. Many pro-Palestinian commentators condemn October 7th as terrorism and yet still consider themselves as pro-Palestinian and anti-Israel. If you want to think of it in those types of binary terms. In fact, this binary that you are either pro-Palestine, that accepts everything done in the name of Palestine has to be right, or you have to be pro-Israel, meaning everything done in the name of Israel thus is correct. It's just blatantly shallow. It reminds me of Bush's famous statement after 9/11. You are either with us or with the terrorists.
Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
What? You can't condemn both terrorism and Western invasion and occupation at the same time, because maybe you have a foundational thought and system that you attempt to judge both sides by. You can't say this is evil, but this other act is a greater evil that would cause more death and destruction and wouldn't even solve the problem. You then state this.
The first argument, whose central premise is that Israel is illegitimate, seems to be at the core of every debate.
Note how you subtly framed this as either you believe Israel has a right to exist or it doesn't. If you thus oppose Israeli actions in Gaza, you believe Israel doesn't have the right to exist. Do you see the way that you are framing this? And many pro-Palestinians don't actually think like that. Some people may oppose Israeli actions but believe it has the right to exist. Some oppose Israel because it's continually expanding its occupation into the West Bank. Others oppose Israel because Israel doesn't agree to a two-state solution. Others oppose Israel because they oppose Zionism, which believes in creating a specific ethno-racial country for Jews and thus have created an apartheid conditions for Palestinians. I oppose the legitimacy of Israel as this ethno-racial state because of my foundational principles of Islam. But what are yours? Oh wait, you haven't specified any. But if you held to liberal, secular, democratic principles, then you'd have to be consistent and say that you'd also oppose Israel as an ethno-racial state too. That's because in 2018, Israeli parliament passed a law called the National State Law, stating very clearly that the right to exercise national self-determination in Israel is, quote, unique to the Jewish people. Further, as former Israeli PM Ariel Sharon also stated, our forefathers did not come here to build a democracy, but to build a Jewish state. This is what he's saying. Do you agree with this? Do you support Israel's right to exist where self-determination is unique to the Jewish people?
If we believe every pro-Palestinian claim and accept that Israel was created through the forced placement of European Jews in a foreign land by Western powers, we must look for a comparable situation in which a country was created through some form of displacement of the native population. Most of you live in such a country. The United States, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada are all the products of invasion, colonization, and brutal conquest.
You again are not using first principle thinking. You're just making comparisons, and the comparisons are bad. Here your argument is that a country remains valid even if it's built on colonial European expansion and the ethnic cleansing of indigenous population. Why should I grant that? Why should I consider it correct that a European colonial power can colonize and genocide the indigenous population to take over their land? Why should I consider that correct? Where is your foundational thought and foundational thinking to justify that position? Why should I just grant it? And why should any Palestinian simply grant that position as well? You then try to use this argument. Firstly, if the Native Americans were the majority of the land of America as Palestinians form in Palestine, i.e. they are 54% of the population of historic Palestine today, then I'd actually think they'd have a very good argument to demand their land back, i.e. the Native Americans. However, due to the genocide perpetrated against the Native Americans, they simply don't have the population and demographics to demand their land back. They are a tiny fraction of what they used to be. But moreover, let's say they did undertake a terrorist attack against Americans.
The United States government would not tolerate missile strikes and terrorist rampages from Native American reservations. Neither would any government of any country under any circumstances.
would America then bomb the living crap out of them, displacing the entire population, destroying or damaging over 60% of their buildings, and use starvation as a weapon of war? Would that be the response, and would that be moral and valid? And if you want to take your analogy, then America would see this as a criminal act of terrorism and wouldn't declare war on the entire Native American population. That's not how they would act. You wouldn't see the president describe them as human animals, or ministers argue for dropping a nuke on their American reservations. Well, at least no right-minded person would think this way. Secondly, on this first argument, you seem oblivious that this isn't about a historic wrong done in the distant past, but continual wrongs that are being perpetuated against the Palestinians even today. Palestinians are still considered refugees, unable to go back to their homes they were ethnically cleansed from, whether it's 1948 or 1967. Palestinians facing eviction today by Israeli settlers in the West Bank, and continual colonial expansion into their lands that even the United Nations claims is meant to be Palestinian lands. Walls of separation in the West Bank which prohibits and controls Palestinian movements. They still face a policy of apartheid which is undertaken to create conditions of life difficult, and Israel hoping it will force the Palestinians out so that they can expand Israel expansion within the region. For someone who supposedly learned about this now, you still seem ignorant of what's actually occurring there. And this isn't just a historic wrong. This is a wrong we are seeing before our very eyes today.
The second argument centers on the idea that October 7th was a response to Israeli occupation and brutality. This, again, seems reasonable to many people. After all, what would it take for you to behave the way Hamas did on October 7th? The problem with this argument is that what happened on October 7th was not an attempt to weaken Israel militarily. It was not an attempt to break Hamas militants out of Israeli jails. It was not an attack on the Israeli Defense Force. It was not a prison breakout, as some people like to describe it, because when people break out of a prison, they don't normally head to the nearest town and start massacring women and children. October 7th was, by design and implementation, a terrorist attack whose purpose was to slaughter civilians, terrify Israeli society, and nothing else. This was not an act of resistance. It was an act of terrorism, which is why Israel had to react to it in the manner that it has, and why any other country would have done the same.
This is a really weak argument. You're basically trying to claim that occupation forced into concentration camp like Gaza has been described, the bombings that have killed thousands of people before, and the apartheid system had no motivating factor behind October 7th. This is a really bad argument. This is like claiming that Nat Turner's rebellion wasn't about slavery because they had no means to actually end slavery or defeat the American state. The rebellion killed women and children, therefore this wasn't about slavery, it was just about brutality and just random killing and terrorizing populations. Again, we can agree killing innocent civilians is wrong, but that doesn't mean there is no relation to the brutal occupation the Palestinians have faced for over 75 years. That's cognitive dissonance on a level rarely seen before to make that argument. October 7th, whether one agrees to it or not, was done for political and military objectives. Whether they achieved it or not is a separate issue, or whether they were right or not is a separate point, or whether the means of achieving this were right is not the debate. That's not what I'm trying to argue. The point is, there were strategic objectives they were looking to achieve. Firstly, they wanted to prevent Saudi normalization deal with Israel that they saw would have abandoned the Palestinian cause. Secondly, they wanted to capture Israelis in order to negotiate the release of Palestinian captives, something that's occurred in the past. Thirdly, and this is highly controversial point, and it's not a point that I'm arguing for, I'm just saying this is how they see it, but they don't see civilians who form part of IDF reservists as illegitimate targets. They see them as part of the military occupation of their land. Anyone 18 or above undergoes military service for Israel and remains a reservist that could be compulsory called up till the age of 40, and still after the age of 40 have the opportunity to volunteer for the Israeli force after that age. Again, not a justification, but I'm explaining that to argue they had no political or military objective is just simply false. Hamas recognizes that Palestinians need the support of Arab and Muslim world. Their struggle against the occupation highlights their condition, and they use this to garner support from the Arab world. So them being seen to struggle against Israel gains support from the Arab world, which then gives them the ability to help them resist further the occupation that they are facing. In that sense, to weaken Arab rulers' attempt to normalize, to gather support from the Arab masses, and to put Palestinians back at the fore of the world's attention is an objective they achieved. And the fact that Israel is made to look as a complete rogue genocidal state that's facing an ICJ court ruling into their potential genocide, or that the ICC are now looking to get arrest warrants against Netanyahu and others, then it could be argued they achieved that too. Again, I'm not saying I agree with October 7th or their objectives, nor whether it was the most strategic thing to do. What I'm showing is that they had distinct military and political objectives, other than just what you call it as terrorizing the population.
The third argument is that Israel is killing civilians. This is the one claim made by the anti-Israel side that is undeniably true. However, this is an example of the emotive but irrelevant context I mentioned earlier.
Ironically, you've been making emotive arguments, such as claiming per capita 36,000 Americans would have died, or that what would America do if Mexican militants killed Americans? You're attempting to appeal to emotions, then justifying Israeli actions, but then ignoring it, ignoring emotions and the sentiments, or condemning the argument when it comes to justifying or sympathizing at least with the Palestinians.
Civilians are always killed in war. The question is not whether they're being killed, but who bears responsibility for their deaths and who can stop the killing. Again, applying first principles thinking, we must reach for a comparable example.
There's that first claim to first principles again, and then not knowing what it is and how to apply it. It's not a comparison. Honestly, are people out here thinking that you have made some really strong and capable arguments?
Hamas has repeatedly stated that given the opportunity, they will repeat the October 7th attacks again and again and again. While this may seem shocking to us in the West, it makes perfect sense given that Hamas believes Israel is illegitimate and would like to see it gone.
Hold on, I thought you said there was no military or political objective for October 7th. Now you are claiming that Hamas would continue it because they see this as an objective to eliminate Israel. Well, that's a military and political objective. Maybe they want to engage in asymmetrical warfare that makes Israelis feel unsafe and thus decide to leave, changing the demographics even further in favor of the Palestinians, such that to create an Zionist ethno-supremacist state becomes ever more unfeasible. Again, you can disagree and criticize it and say it's immoral, but it's an objective and thus renders your previous criticisms to the second pro-Palestinian argument invalid.
Hamas has repeatedly stated that given the opportunity, they will repeat the October 7th attacks again and again and again. While this may seem shocking to us in the West, it makes perfect sense given that Hamas believes Israel is illegitimate and would like to see it gone. This means that unless Israel destroys or degrades their ability to carry out their threats, it is likely to experience more terrorist attacks again and again. Does anyone seriously believe that any government of any country anywhere in the world would or could react to something like 12 9/11s in one day and the threat of more to follow as many times as possible with anything other than all-out war?
Again, claiming it was 12 9/11s, that's attempting to play on emotions. Also, look at how you're framing each one of your points. All are framed around whether October 7th is justified or not. But let's say we only focus on October 7th. Does that justify an all-out war, use of starvation as strategy war? Does it justify the continued expansion of Israeli settlements into the West Bank? Does it justify taking Palestinian hostages in what they call detention without charge, raping and torturing those hostages, with members of the Israeli Knesset arguing this is acceptable?
להמשיך כרגיל.
להכניס מקל לרקטום של בן אדם, זה לגיטימי?
כן, אם הוא נוח'בה, הכל לגיטימי לעשות לו.
אוקיי.
הכל.
מצוין.
הכל.
זה מה שרציתי.
הכל, האנשים האלה, אתה יודע מה עשו?
אוקיי.
And if your problem is with Hamas statements that you find egregious, then let's make a comparison. I know you like making comparison. Israeli Prime Minister likened the Palestinians to the Amalekites from the Bible, when the commando god was supposedly to kill all men, women, children, and even farmyard animals. Or the Israeli president who claimed that in Gaza there were no uninvolved civilians. They are effectively collectively responsible for October 7th. Or Ariel Kalnar, a member of the Israeli parliament for Benjamin Netanyahu's Likud party, who said, right now, one goal, Nakba, a Nakba that will overshadow the Nakba of 1948. Obviously, the Nakba is what? The ethnic cleansing of Palestinians from their homes by Israel, by the Zionists to create the Israeli state. Konstantin, I could literally give you dozens of such statements from Israeli politicians that effectively form part of the argument that South Africa brought in their case for genocide against Israel. That's why they're facing charge of genocide from the ICJ, because of these statements. Are you equivocating then? Calls for murder only bad when it comes from the Palestinian side? Is that how you see it? Then you claim that Israel couldn't but prosecute the war the way that they are doing it. What they have done is obliterated Gaza, made it, as Norman Finkelstein said, unlivable.
And who can end the killing? Well, theoretically Israel could, of course, but for the reason we just discussed, they can't, won't, and shouldn't. That leaves Hamas, who could have returned the hostages and surrendered the people who took them. What is more, they could hide their civilians in the vast network of tunnels they've built to reduce casualties. Instead, they refuse to build bomb shelters and do everything they can to maximize civilian casualties. That's not my opinion, it's something Hamas are themselves proud of. A senior spokesman for the group, Sami Abu Zuhri, gave an interview on Palestinian station Al-Aqsa TV the last time this conflict flared up. The policy of people confronting Israeli warplanes with their bare chests in order to protect their homes has proven effective against the occupation, he said. We in Hamas call upon our people to adopt this policy in order to protect Palestinian homes. So yes, the deaths of civilians are tragic, and in a modern world where you can fill your social media feed with gruesome footage, that tragedy can be broadcast straight into your home 24/7. But the responsibility for their deaths is entirely with Hamas, and the failure to put a stop to the killing is theirs and theirs alone.
Here's the interesting thing. You attempt to claim that the entirety of the deaths are all down to Hamas. They're at fault. They shouldn't have poked this mindless, crazy bear. It was their fault that their children got mauled to death by this bear. But here's the thing. Israel, although some may claim otherwise, are not a mindless beast you stay away from for fear that they would attack you. Rather, Israel made a rational consideration as to the amount of destruction they wanted to cause. For example, if someone holds people hostage in a school and the police bomb and kill everyone inside the school, including all the hostages, then you can't argue that, well, all the deaths are upon the hostage takers. No, that's not how it works. The ones shooting and killing are responsible, especially if they're doing it indiscriminately. Remember also, Hamas was willing to release hostages, did release hostages in exchange Palestinian hostages that are currently kept or were currently kept in Israeli dungeons. If one of the key goals is to release the hostages, then the surefire way would be to negotiate their release with Hamas, something Israel doesn't want to do. Remember, this is a state that believes in the Hannibal Directive. Killing Israelis is more preferable to them than having them being taken as hostages, such that it forces Israel to negotiate their release. At most, you can argue that Hamas brought their civilians in harm's way by engaging in armed resistance from a state that was looking for an excuse to enact a genocide. But guess what? The one engaging in the genocide will be the one culpable. So the claim that this is entirely on Hamas is just false. That's your argument. It's entirely on Hamas. Look, while claiming that Israel are not killing civilians, you've completely glossed over the numerous cases where Palestinians have been directly targeted. Hind Rajab, a 6-year-old girl, was traveling with her family in a car that was mowed down by gunfire by Israelis when she and her sister attempted to call for an ambulance. And when the ambulance arrived, they too, the ambulance and the medics, were all killed. Sadly, Hind, this 6-year-old child, was brutally murdered. All on Hamas, is it? What about the number of children with bullet wounds from snipers to the head? Is that all Hamas's fault? What about the number of Palestinians killed while holding the white flag? Something that international organizations have produced reports on. All Hamas's fault. At what time are you going to call out the brutal, disgusting killings that have been directed by the Israeli state while their politicians themselves are calling for a Nakba that was worse than the one that occurred in 1948, which, by the way, killed 15,000 people and caused 750,000 people to be ethnically cleansed from their homes? When are you going to call this out? Your final argument is to claim that Israel isn't indiscriminately killing civilians.
Israel's attacks are indiscriminate and designed to inflict civilian casualties. This is actually the simplest argument of the 4 to address because it is an empirical matter. The war in Gaza is not the first conflict in human history. We can compare the ratio of combatant to civilian deaths in this war to others. What happens when we do? Historically, urban warfare operations result in a casualty ratio of 9 civilians for every 1 enemy fighter killed. In Gaza, it is 2 to 1. In other words, Despite the deliberate attempts by Hamas to increase the number of civilian casualties, Israel has been extraordinarily successful in reducing them. This doesn't mean that there won't be incidents in which innocent Palestinians are killed, and, as in any war, there will likely be war crimes committed by both sides. But overall, the numbers don't lie.
Well, I've already mentioned children who were rushed into hospital with sniper bullets to the head, including 3 Israeli hostages killed by their own Israeli forces while holding white flags. So now you use the claim of the ratio of combatants to civilian deaths, that it's relatively low, a 2-to-1 ratio. Where are you getting this from? This is clearly a Hasbara Israeli talking point. While they claim they've killed 20,000 Hamas fighters, they can't determine how many civilians they've actually claimed.
How many civilians do you believe you've killed?
We don't have exact figures, as you know, it's the fog of war.
But you've got exact numbers for Hamas terrorists you've killed. Why wouldn't you know how many civilians you've killed?
Because obviously our focus is to go after the Hamas terrorists.
No, you've told me you know how many Hamas terrorists you've killed, but you don't seem to have any idea how many civilians you've killed. I'm just bemused. Why wouldn't you keep count of both?
I don't have that information to give you, Piers. If I did, I would.
You've literally no idea how many civilians you've been killing.
I can tell you definitively that our aim is to go after Hamas.
No, hang on. I'm sorry to push you on this. That's quite extraordinary. You're an official spokesman for the Israeli government, and you have no idea how many civilians you've killed. I thought you just told me that you were particularly careful about not killing civilians. But if you don't know how many you've killed, how can you say that with any certainty?
In fact, where is this 20,000 number coming from? Are we expected to believe Israel, that all male casualties, apparently, were all Hamas fighters? Because that's where the 20,000 comes from. Over 40,000 people have been killed directly by Israel, and they pluck out the figure of 20,000 because these are the males killed, thus assuming all males in Gaza are Hamas and valid targets. That, by definition, would be considered indiscriminate. But let's dig deeper. We are supposedly told that this is an extremely targeted action that kills relatively few civilians than compared to other conflicts. But yet, more children and women have been killed in Gaza by the Israeli military over the past year than equivalent period of any other conflict over the past 2 decades. Up to March 2024, more than 885 health workers have been reportedly killed in Gaza and the West Bank since October 7th, more than any other conflict. And what about journalists? Well, Israel has killed more journalists in Gaza than in any conflict in 30 years. So why should I believe their figures that they are extremely precise? The number of women killed, the number of children killed, the number of health workers killed, the number of journalists killed in Gaza exceeds any other number of any other conflict in a single year this century. That only comes about if you're indiscriminate in your killings. So let's go even deeper. Israel uses an AI program called Lavender, which determines which targets to hit and what is an acceptable number of civilian casualties in order to take out an enemy combatant. The AI programs determined that the best time to bomb these targets was at night when they were at home with their families. The AI program also determined that for a low-level target, i.e. enemy combatant, 15 to 20 civilians could be killed. Remember, this is at night, knowing that the target was at home with their family, including children. Where's this 9-to-1 ratio or 2-to-1 ratio that keep talking about? And for a senior Hamas target, the AI determined that 100 plus civilians could be killed in order to kill that one target. How's that not indiscriminate? In fact, if we take the true numbers of Palestinians who have died in this conflict due to direct and indirect actions perpetrated by Israel, including those who are currently buried and dead under the rubble, or those who died because Israel destroyed the health infrastructure of Gaza, destroying hospitals and health clinics, then the actual number is close to 186,000 people killed. This is the number that researchers for the medical journal Lancet report as their estimates. And even then, they claim this is conservative estimates of the number of dead due to this conflict and due directly by what Israel have done in Gaza. But let me leave you with this. According to official figures from Israel themselves, October 7th resulted in 1,139 people being killed. That's in Israel. That includes 373 Israeli security forces. So if you claim that on average urban warfare results in a 9-to-1 casualty ratio, i.e. 9 civilians for every 1 fighter killed, well, according to you, Konstantin, Hamas actions on October the 7th was a 3-to-1. Was better than 3-1 in fact. Better than average. Does this mean you can't claim Hamas weren't indiscriminately killing Israelis? If you did, then your whole argument about ratios collapses. Why can't I use the exact same argument that you have, that 3-1 is actually a good ratio, it's better than the average of 9-1, and that in all conflicts, war crimes may be committed by both sides, but overall the numbers don't lie.
This doesn't mean that there won't be incidents in which innocent Palestinians are killed, and, as in any war, there will likely be war crimes committed by both sides. But overall, the numbers don't lie.
See, it's a stupid argument, and as I've shown, we can clearly see clear examples of indiscriminate targeting of Palestinians. Look, I could have made this video even longer, and I really don't want to. I haven't even addressed your pager attack. But in summary, I looked at your arguments. I found that you didn't use any first principles to justify or build your arguments. Instead, you just tried to appeal to emotion. Ironically, 12 9/11s being repeated. This is done to elicit emotions from your audience. And then you try to make comparisons. But even then, your comparisons simply failed because your comparisons were built upon faulty analogies. Either you are being inconsistent or you simply use flawed analysis. Overall, your argument fails. But really, I doubt you were ever on the fence in the first place.